You're still watching News at Prime. In the wake of the Marshalltown fire tragedy, it is important to reflect on how victims can pick up the pieces and move forward after their harrowing experience. Well, let's speak to psychologist David Goncalves and mindset coach Jabu Zwane for more perspective. Gentlemen, very good evening. Not that it is, but it's appreciate you coming onto the show. David, allow me to start off with you, and let's talk about the psychological impact or the trauma associated with an event such as this.
Gosh, you know, it's such a difficult thing to unpack, because it's not just the trauma of being in a burning building itself, but these were clearly families, people trying to escape a burning building, many fatalities, as we've heard. So there's just an untold amount of trauma for the people involved, for people around it. I've even had a chance to speak to some of the journalists involved who themselves are dealing with the trauma of this. It's a massive, massive incident that's going to have long-lasting effects on many of these people.
Now, is it, when we talk about picking up pieces after the intro, and they're literally pieces, some have no pieces to pick up. So what is that sort of challenge, Jabu? Because that kind of speaks to the mindset and overcoming that element of trauma, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's important, again, to accept that something like that has happened. Difficult as difficult as it may be that it has happened. And a big part of that is that picking up those pieces, I think is a crucial part of that acceptance. Because one of the things that you don't want to do is to just completely shut down, completely walk away, completely almost like pretend that it didn't happen, because I'm part of that shock.
Well, what we're seeing from a few of the interviews that my colleague Katlego had with two of the gentlemen was that they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to be relocated. They felt, you know what, they're better off in that habitat that they were familiar with.
Familiarity is a crucial part of us as people, because again, it helps us to predict. Familiarity helps us to feel like we have that sense of control, which when something like this happens is that you feel, and you have lost a bit of control. And there's a way of trying to fight to gain back that control, and that's why you want to still stay over there. So it makes absolute sense that somebody would not want to leave there. Although some of us on the outside can look at it and think, but why would they want to stay in such a terrible place? But for them, it's a familiar place. It's a way of trying to gain back control, and hopefully they can get back into some predictable routine again.
Now, David, that grief and trauma that these individuals are facing is obviously not a one-size-fits-all, if you will, when it comes to the grief and trauma. How does it differ from one individual to the next? And we know that several children lost their lives, but there are also some children that would have survived. How traumatic? Is it trauma any different for the individual who came out of that fire unscathed but was a part of it, versus somebody who lost a relative or saw somebody jump off the balcony, for instance?
For sure, there'd be differences in how people sort of digest the trauma and go through it. Certainly, you know, it's not just the trauma of having seen a burning building and people lose their homes, but there are many people involved here who've lost family members, lost children, and that's not something you kind of get over. It's just a pain you learn to live with. So, and not only that, people losing their homes, people losing the familiar place wherever they stayed for whatever reason. The fact that people won't even leave the scene in some cases speaks to the desperation. You know, that is all they've got, is that place, that familiarity. So people will definitely process this in different ways. Children, for example, don't have emotional language. So they'll, sometimes just process it in behavior or show it in behaviors. Adults have perhaps a little bit more emotional language, but there would be a wide array of different responses to how people deal with this trauma, for sure.
So, Jabu, it's a lot about the mindset, as you've suggested. Now, I want to talk a little bit about children and pick up from where David left off, that children are obviously a part of this, and they don't have the mental fortitude in as far as, you know what, I have to overcome this. So how do children deal with trauma? I mean, what do they need to do, or do they not know what they need to do in order to deal with the trauma and the anguish?
Having experienced trauma myself as a kid, I can tell you that I don't remember quite a lot of what I went through. But one thing that I've known, that I've observed even as a pastor for a long time, kids have got creative ways of dealing with challenges. I think something that kids have as an advantage over adults is exactly that the lack of mental fortitude is almost like an advantage, because then they don't really fully comprehend the depth of the trauma, the depth of the danger that they're in, and they do what children do, which is create different ways of making themselves feel safe. I don't know if you remember this movie, Pursuit of Happiness. They interviewed the son of Mr. David Gardner, I think is his name, and they asked him, when your dad was going up and down on the trains and then lock himself in the bathroom where he didn't have a place to sleep, what were you feeling? And he said, I don't remember anything. All I remember was that I was with my dad, and it was like we're having an adventure through running. I remember a lot of running, but it was like we're having an adventure. And I think there's an element of that thankfully with children can be there. We feel for them as parents a lot because we understand the danger that they're in. But I think just concentrating, if you're a parent, in providing that safe space and then a bit of a routine along, even though with the craziness, that can be very helpful.
David, I want to take you back to the floods in KwaZulu-Natal several months ago. When we had conversations with some of my colleagues that were covering the event, in fact, post that event, the organization then provided counseling services and a facility for grief, if you will. Now, how do ancillary staff or ancillary service providers deal with that? Because you don't always realize how much it hits you. And sometimes you may not even know that it's hit you. What are some of the things to look out for, or certainly the techniques that you can use to deal with the trauma of being a reporter in that place, being shocked by what you see, and having to live with it post that period?
Gosh, what will often happen with reporters and ancillary, healthcare providers and that, is that when they're in that moment, you go into crisis mode. I can remember doing that, working in the ICUs during COVID, for example. You get into work mode and you've got to do what you've got to do because that's what you've been trained to do. And often people in those positions will begin to experience symptoms afterwards. Irritability, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping, in some instances even, flashbacks, nightmares, things like that. But the most common thing that you'll find with people, whether they're ancillary health workers or even journalists in those positions, is that irritability and difficulty concentrating. That's what I've seen the most.
Yeah, but I want to come back to mindset issues. Dr. Joel Patla, the health minister, spoke about individuals that had leaped off several balconies, some with broken limbs, some have broken their bodies and so on, and some obviously have been disfigured because of the burns. Now, just how much is required to overcome and deal with that? So you now have a lack of capacity where you could run, pick up stuff and do all you wanted. All of a sudden, you either don't have a limb, or if you were a young woman, that beautiful face is no longer there.
Mindset-wise, you almost have to redeem, again, what you can redeem from the wreckage. Whether it's the wreckage of your own body, as far as how you've been impacted. And one of the things that you've got to learn to do is, what do I still have? What do I still have in my arsenal? What is still positive? What can I still use to rebuild back my life? And not to completely just write everything off and say, well, listen, I've gone through this and quit.
But the question is, how many of us want to keep living after all of that, or have the energy or the motivation? People may not decide that I no longer want to live, but it might be expressed in the absence of willpower and a desire to fight, to overcome.
I would say one of the things that if you are in that place, go to a place where you can sort of borrow from other people's strength. Find a community. There are many people, not just you, but there are other people there where you can talk, they can understand what you're going through, where you can just cry. First of all, find a community as well. And then as time progresses, you do get stronger. And sometimes we just have to sit, so you almost have to ride on other people's strength around ourselves. Because, it is, like Dr. said, it's very traumatic and it's very difficult. So that's probably, for me, one of the first places to start, is that I remember in my own trauma, what carried me is the people around me.
Now, David, if you were to have a conversation with an individual who's just come out of that fire, has survived, doesn't know where to start, where would you start with that conversation?
Gosh, people need an opportunity to express, first of all, and express whatever it is that they need to express. Because, like you said earlier, people process these traumas in different ways. So definitely you'd start with just expressing them, giving them room to say and express whatever it is that they need to, because in a scenario like this, you'll have a lot of mixed emotions, anger, grief, all of these different things, people feeling cheated, people feeling angry even. You can even feel betrayed by a relative that you've lost tragically because they've abandoned you, So there's all of those mixed emotions need air, they need time to be expressed, and that is where you'd start. But it certainly is a big job because it's not something that's kind of addressable or treatable in one instance. This is going to take a process, it's going to take time to get people to where they need to be.
So let's talk about closure, and I'd like you both to touch on that aspect. And this stems from the fact that of the 74 people that lost their lives in this tragedy, only 12 bodies are recognizable. So effectively what it means is that multiple individuals will go into those morgues, such as the one in Diepkloof in Soweto, and not be able to confirm if indeed their loved one is amongst the 74. There was a woman who came out, whom we saw yesterday, who was hoping that her daughter had survived. So in that instance, you don't know whether your child or relative has survived. How do you cope with that?
There's a part of me that wants to say, at this particular point, actually, we need the government, we need the private society to allocate some of those tools that Dr. David is talking about. If I were in government, I would literally, in this process, I would have psychologists, I would have counselors, I would have people around that can be able to help the person that has gone into that space and experienced that shock right there and then and give them an opportunity to debrief. Because, to go back to your house without necessarily even understanding sort of the trauma that you yourself have gone through, without knowing whether or not your child is there, and having to see a human being in that condition, it requires a lot more help. I think that, even if I were to sit here and try to talk to somebody from across the TV screen, it wouldn't be enough. You'd literally need professional help. There has got to be a safe space, a grieving space, a counseling space that we have to create. I would say right now to the government, if they're listening, they must summon whatever resources that they possibly have to help those people right now.
I don't doubt that they're listening. David, how would you execute something like that?
Gosh, what a big job it is, because if, for example, bodies are unidentifiable on site, it means we have to wait for DNA testing and things like that. And what that does is it disallows closure. This lady, for example, was looking for her daughter. She cannot recognize the bodies that she's being shown. So not only do you have the trauma of potentially losing your daughter, you're now having the trauma of having looked at all of these. They get shown pictures of these corpses. So developing a sense developing an environment where closure is possible is certainly going to take quite a while, and we do need government to step in for sure, not only counselling services, support services, but DNA testing needs to happen quickly. People need, even if you've lost somebody, the whole process of funerals and mourning, those have a function, and those cannot continue unless you know where your loved one is. So we really need to, private business, like Jabu was saying, private business, government needs to dive in and throw some resources at this, because it's going to take a very long time for people to have closure if it's just kind of run badly.
There's almost a need for a community to come together to assist these individuals. Now, one of the things that we understand from this building in Marshalltown is that it was inhabited by individuals from all over the continent. So we had South Africans, we had many people, many refugees, if you will, for want a better description. So almost a fragmented lifestyle, if you will. Now, that doesn't make it any easier for those individuals, does it? I mean, the language barriers, when Katla or Sokoto was interviewing some of the individuals, you could pick up that they weren't fluent in English, probably more fluent in their own home languages. So how do you support someone when potentially your only common language is a grief that you're enduring?
The most internationally and well understood human language is presence. It's love. It's nonverbal. It's not what we say, but it's actually what we do. And I think for me right now, it's important for even all of us South Africans to step out, to get out of whether they're illegal or foreign or whatever they're from, but to think about the human condition they find themselves in, and for all us to rally behind that and to show our humanity in that way. And I think being present with food, with water, and us rallying together and giving clothes and giving whatever support we can, that is the only language that whenever you are in trauma, you understand. Because even if you and I speak English right now, when a person is in trauma, my mental capacity to interpret the complexities of the language in that moment are very, very diminished. So it doesn't, even if we can understand each other in terms of the language, the only language that people understand very well in trauma is love. That's it.
Gentlemen, sad that we meet under these circumstances, but certainly appreciate your time both unpacking the rather traumatic experience for us. Psychologist David Goncalves and mindset coach Jabu Zwane for more perspective, speaking to us around the Marshalltown fire and certainly those individuals that passed away.